Big Shaq saves a woman from a burning building without realizing she once saved his life. Ellie Carter has spent years running, but when someone sets a fire meant to erase her, she's forced to confront the truth. It wasn't an accident. Shaq, the man who saved her, digs deeper and discovers her enemy is his too. The past is catching up, and this time, running isn't an option. Now they must face the man who tried to destroy them both, before he finishes what he started. A suspenseful, high-stakes thriller packed with twists, secrets, and a final showdown that changes everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The city never really sleeps, even at 2 a.m. Sirens wail, lights flicker, and somewhere, someone is either chasing trouble or running from it. Big Shaq was neither. He was always running toward it. The fire had started small, a flickering ember in the dead of night, creeping through the old wooden structure of Holloway Heights, an aging apartment complex on the city's west side. But by the time the alarm reached the station, it had already consumed half the building. Orange flames roared against the black sky, thick smoke curling into the air like a living, breathing monster. Shaq gripped his helmet, securing it tighter as the fire truck screeched to a halt. The heat hit him even from a distance, a suffocating wave of destruction. The radio crackled. Confirmed occupants still inside. We've got reports of at least one person trapped on the 3rd floor. Stairwells compromised. Shaq didn't hesitate. 3rd floor. I'm going in, he said, already moving before anyone could stop him. Shaq, wait! His captain barked, but he was already past the barricade, disappearing into the inferno. The second he stepped inside, the world became chaos. The thick smoke burned his lungs beneath the oxygen mask. Flames licked at the walls, the wooden floors groaning under the weight of the fire. The entire structure was moments from collapse, but Shaq moved fast, his heavy boots pounding against the cracking floorboards. A scream, faint, barely audible over the roaring fire. He turned sharply, scanning through the shifting haze of smoke. There, a figure curled near a shattered window, coughing violently. Shaq surged forward, barely dodging a section of ceiling as it collapsed behind him. The woman was hunched against the heat, arms shielding her face, blonde hair streaked with soot. He reached her in 2 strides, dropping to his knees. Hey, can you hear me? She looked up, eyes glassy, unfocused. The smoke was choking her. She wouldn't last much longer. Shaq didn't waste another second. He scooped her into his arms, shielding her from the falling debris. She was light, fragile, her breath shallow against his chest. The building trembled around them, groaning under the fire's merciless assault. Stay with me, he muttered, sprinting back toward the exit. Flames curled along the walls, snaking toward him like they could sense fresh oxygen. The stairs were gone, nothing but burning wood and a deadly drop below. No time to think, only move. Shaq adjusted his grip, holding her close, and took the only way out. Through the window. The glass shattered around them as Shaq propelled forward, crashing through the 2nd floor awning before landing hard on the pavement below. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he ignored it. The woman stirred in his arms, coughing, but she was breathing. The paramedics swarmed in, voices frantic, hands reaching to pull her onto a stretcher. Someone patted Shaq's back, yelling something about a hell of a save. But he barely registered it. Because as the woman's face tilted toward the flickering streetlights, something in his mind snapped into place. A memory, buried deep. He knew her, or at least he thought he did. The paramedics rushed her toward the ambulance, her soot-streaked features partially hidden beneath the oxygen mask. She didn't look at him, didn't even seem aware of his presence. But Shaq, he couldn't look away. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had seen a ghost. The fire raged behind them, but Shaq wasn't thinking about it anymore. His chest was tight, his breathing uneven, not from the smoke but from something deeper. Something he couldn't explain. The way she looked just now. The shape of her face. The way her blonde hair had fallen against her cheek. It wasn't just familiarity. It was certainty. He had seen that face before. But where? His hands clenched at his sides, the sweat on his skin now feeling colder than the night air. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because something told him. The past wasn't done with him yet. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment everything was a blur. White walls, an IV in her arm, and a soft light casting long shadows across the room. Then came the memories, hitting her in sharp flashes. Fire, smoke, trapped. Her breath hitched. How did I get out? The answer stood by the window watching her. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes. His silhouette was imposing, but something about his posture was unsettled. He wasn't just looking at her. He was studying her, like a puzzle missing its final piece. Ellie swallowed, her throat dry. Who? The man took a slow step forward, his face coming into view. Shaq. She didn't know his name, but there was something familiar about the way he carried himself, confident, yet reserved. His dark eyes flickered with something unreadable, as if he were caught between recognition and disbelief. "You're awake," he said, voice low. Ellie licked her lips. "Did you? I pulled you out." The words sat heavy between them. "Thank you," she whispered. It felt too small, too insignificant for what he had done. Shaq didn't react. He just kept looking at her. Ellie shifted under his gaze. Do we know each other?" Shaq's jaw tensed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like he was weighing his response. Finally, he exhaled. "Number, I don't think so." But the way he said it made her doubt his answer. The next few hours passed in a haze of nurses checking her vitals, a doctor explaining her minor smoke inhalation, and paperwork she barely processed. Through it all, Shaq lingered in the background. He wasn't hovering, but he also wasn't leaving. She should have found it odd, maybe even unsettling. But something told her he wasn't just watching her. He was watching his own memories unravel. She caught him staring more than once, his expression clouded, like he was trying to place her. And the strange thing was, she felt it too. A nagging feeling, like meeting someone you were supposed to remember but couldn't. Like a song stuck in the back of your mind, just out of reach. Ellie pushed it aside. Maybe it was the trauma. Maybe she was imagining it. But Shaq wasn't. Shaq sat in the hospital hallway, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. Why did she feel so damn familiar? His gut wouldn't let it go. He had saved dozens of people in his career, but this was different. When he carried Ellie out of that fire, something inside him locked into place. But the memory, it wasn't clear. It was buried, fragmented. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming at him. "I've seen her before. I know her. But how?" He closed his eyes, forcing himself to replay everything. Not just the fire, but before that. Years ago. A flash of headlights. A woman's voice. A burning wreckage. Shaq's eyes snapped open. Number, that's not possible. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. A message. Ellie was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. Something gnawed at her, something beyond the fire. A feeling, deep in her bones, that this wasn't over. The nurse had left her phone on the bedside table. She reached for it, wincing at the soreness in her muscles. A single notification glowed on the screen. Unknown number, one new message. Her fingers hovered over it before finally opening it. "You should have burned." Her breath stopped. The world tilted. Her stomach twisted into a knot so tight it hurt. Number, no. The fire hadn't been an accident. Someone wanted her dead, and they had just made sure she knew it. Shaq heard the sharp, panicked intake of breath from Ellie's room and was on his feet instantly. When he stepped inside, he saw her, pale, frozen, clutching her phone like it might explode. Her wide, terrified eyes met his. "What happened?" His voice was calm, steady, the kind of steady that came right before a storm. Ellie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She turned the phone toward him. Shaq's gaze dropped to the screen. The words burned into his mind. "You should have burned." The air shifted. Ellie expected him to ask questions, maybe even dismiss it. But instead, something in Shaq's face changed. like a puzzle piece snapping into place. Like something he had been searching for just became terrifyingly clear. He didn't know how. He didn't know why. But suddenly he was sure of one thing. This wasn't the first fire that had tried to kill Eleanor Carter. And for some reason, he was starting to think that he had been part of her story long before tonight. The message lingered in the air long after Shaq read it. You should have burned. He could feel Ellie watching him, waiting for his reaction. But Shaq had learned long ago how to keep his emotions locked down. Whatever storm this text had set off inside him, he wasn't going to let it show. Ellie, however, was unraveling right in front of him. Her hands trembled as she gripped the phone, her breathing shallow. She looked like someone who had just come face to face with a ghost. This... Her voice was barely above a whisper. This can't be happening. Shaq finally spoke. Who would send you this? Ellie shook her head. I don't know. A lie. She might not have known the sender, but she knew what this meant. Shaq could see it in her eyes, the way she had retreated into herself, the way her mind was already running through a list of possibilities she didn't want to admit were real. She wasn't just scared. She was remembering something. And so was he. Shaq stepped out of the hospital room, needing space to think. The cold, sterile hallway offered no comfort. His mind was a mess, tangled with memories that refused to come fully into focus. Ellie. That name didn't feel familiar, but her face. It was there, in the back of his mind, like a song he had once known by heart but could no longer hum. He closed his eyes, pressing a hand to the side of his head. And then, screeching tires. A crash. The smell of gasoline. A voice, urgent, panicked. You have to get out, now. His eyes snapped open, his pulse hammering in his ears. What the hell was that? He had flashes of that night sometimes. A night years ago, one he didn't talk about, one he had forced himself to forget. But why was it coming back now? And why did it feel like Ellie was somehow a part of it? Ellie sat on the hospital bed, staring blankly at her phone screen. Whoever sent that message, they knew. They knew she had survived. And that meant one thing: they would try again. Her hands clenched into fists. For years, she had been careful. She had changed her name, her address, erased every trace of the person she used to be. She had buried her past deep, convinced that if she never looked back, it could never catch up. But the fire, it hadn't been random. Someone had set it knowing she was inside. And now, with those 5 chilling words, they had made sure she understood. They weren't finished with her. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She needed to get out of here. She needed to disappear again. But before she could even move, the door swung open. Shaq stepped back inside, his expression unreadable. You need to tell me the truth, he said, voice low. Right now. Ellie swallowed hard. What truth? Shaq exhaled sharply, running a hand over his jaw. That fire wasn't an accident, was it? Her silence was answer enough. You know who did it, he pressed. Ellie shook her head. I don't. You do. His eyes locked onto hers. And you're scared to say their name. A chill ran down her spine. He wasn't wrong. But saying it out loud? That would make it real. And once it was real, there was no going back. Shaq didn't believe in coincidences. Not like this. He had spent years watching things burn, reading the patterns. This fire had too many red flags. So when Ellie refused to talk, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He started looking for answers himself. Sitting in his truck outside the hospital, he pulled up the fire report on his tablet. Cause of fire: undetermined. No signs of electrical failure, no gas leaks. Which meant someone had set it. His jaw tightened. Then, something caught his eye. The apartment wasn't listed under Ellie Carter. It was leased under a different name. A name he didn't recognize, but something about it felt off. Shaq's instincts kicked in. Ellie Carter wasn't just hiding from someone. She was hiding from who she used to be. And that meant whoever had tried to kill her knew exactly who she really was. The next morning, Shaq was back at the hospital, leaning against the wall near Ellie's door when a nurse walked past. She left, the nurse said casually. Shaq's head snapped up. What? Checked herself out an hour ago. A curse slipped from his lips. She ran. He should have seen it coming. The moment she got that message, she had gone into survival mode. He rushed outside, scanning the street. Nothing. She was gone. But Shaq wasn't giving up that easily. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Hey, I need a favor. I need to track someone." A pause. "You finally getting into some trouble, Shaq?" The voice on the other end chuckled. He wasn't in the mood. "Can you do it or not? Send me the details." Shaq hung up and exhaled. Ellie might not have wanted his help, but he wasn't letting her go that easy. Ellie walked quickly, keeping her head down. She had left the hospital with nothing but the clothes on her back. No phone, no credit cards, nothing trackable. She knew how to disappear. She had done it before. But this time she had nowhere left to run. She needed answers. And there was only one person who had them. The person who had sent that message. The person who had tried to kill her. Her fingers curled into fists. She wasn't going to be a victim. Not again. Shaq parked outside the last address connected to Ellie's lease. An old apartment, mostly abandoned. He wasn't expecting to find much. But what he found changed everything. Inside the empty unit, buried beneath old mail and dust-covered furniture, was a photo of him, Shaq, standing next to a woman. A woman who wasn't Ellie, but had the same eyes. His stomach dropped. Memories came rushing back, pieces snapping into place. The car crash, the burning wreckage, and the woman who had saved him that night. Ellie, or whatever her real name was. Shaq's grip tightened around the photo. Now he knew why she felt familiar. She had saved his life once. And now, it was his turn to save hers. The night air was thick with smoke and gasoline. Shaq's mind swam between consciousness and darkness, his body barely registering the searing heat closing in around him. The world had shrunk to a tight, suffocating space filled with flickering orange and black shapes. Somewhere in the distance, sirens howled, a haunting sound swallowed by the roar of the flames. His head throbbed, a deep, pulsing pain at his temple where something had struck him. Blood dripped down the side of his face, mixing with sweat. His limbs felt heavy, useless. The wreckage of his car was a twisted mass of steel, crushed beyond recognition. Smoke poured through the shattered windshield, curling around him like a living thing. The fire was spreading. He needed to move, but his body wouldn't listen. His right leg was pinned under the crushed dashboard. Each attempt to shift sent daggers of pain tearing through his nerves. His breath came fast and shallow as he tried again, panic creeping into his chest. This wasn't just an accident, it was a death sentence. The flames crawled hungrily up the hood, licking at the leaking gas tank. The heat was unbearable now, pressing against his skin, stealing the air from his lungs. If he didn't get out now, he never would. And then, footsteps. A shadow moved just beyond the flames, fast and deliberate. Not a firefighter. Not a cop. Someone else. A woman. Shaq forced his eyes open, blinking against the heat distortion, struggling to focus. The figure moved closer, her silhouette flickering in the firelight. His vision blurred, but he caught glimpses of her through the shifting haze. Blonde hair pulled into a ponytail, a dirt-streaked cheek, piercing blue eyes filled with fear, but not hesitation. She was young but strong, determined. His breath hitched. Who was she? "Hey!" she shouted over the roar of the flames. "Can you move?" Shaq's throat was dry, raw from the smoke. He tried to answer, but his voice barely came out. "Leg. Stuck." The woman didn't hesitate. She climbed onto the twisted metal, wincing as the heat seared her skin. Her hands found the edge of the dashboard, fingers gripping tight. "Hold on," she said, voice firm. And then she pulled. At first, nothing happened. Shaq's body felt like it was being ripped in half, the weight of the wreckage crushing him further. But the woman didn't stop. She gritted her teeth, digging her heels into the ground. Smoke filled her lungs, her eyes burned, but she didn't let go. "Come on," she growled, straining. "Move!" Shaq let out a strangled noise as something shifted. A sharp, white-hot pain tore through his leg. Something cracked, and then he was free. A choked gasp ripped from his throat as he collapsed forward, his body no longer trapped. The woman caught him. "Come on," she urged, looping his arm around her shoulders. "We have to move, now." Shaq's mind swam. He was half dragging, half running as she hauled him away from the wreck. Behind them, the flames roared, and then, boom! The shockwave tore through the pavement, throwing them both forward. Shaq hit the ground hard, the impact rattling his bones. His ears rang, drowning out everything else. For a moment, everything was still. Only the distant wail of sirens remained, echoing through the night. Shaq coughed, rolling onto his side. His vision was spinning, his mind barely processing what had just happened. He had been seconds away from death, and then he saw her. The woman was already on her feet, standing against the backdrop of fire, her face streaked with soot and sweat. Shaq stared, trying to commit her face to memory. "You," he croaked, struggling to sit up. But before he could say another word, she was gone, disappearing into the night, like a ghost. Shaq gasped as he jolted awake. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling fast. For a moment, he thought he could still feel the heat of the fire on his skin, still hear the deafening explosion in his ears. But he wasn't in the wreckage anymore. He was in his truck, parked outside an abandoned apartment. The memory had been buried so deep, locked away in a part of his mind he had never dared to revisit. But now, the truth was staring him in the face. Shaq looked down at the photograph clenched in his hands, a photo of himself, standing next to a woman with familiar blue eyes, Ellie, or whoever she used to be. His breathing was unsteady. The woman who had saved his life that night was the same woman he had just pulled from the fire, and she had no idea. Ellie sat alone in a dim motel room, the cheap yellow light buzzing faintly overhead. She had left the hospital without a plan, without a destination, just a need to disappear before whoever set that fire came back to finish the job. Her hands trembled as she turned the cheap burner phone over in her palm. She hadn't used this number in years, had promised herself she never would again. But the message on the screen had changed everything. "You should have burned." Her breath caught. She forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. Think. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to erase her. Years ago, before she became Ellie Carter, before she learned how to run, she had been someone else. Someone whose life had been ripped apart in a single night. She didn't remember much of it. Only flames. Screaming. A name she wasn't allowed to say anymore. But there was one thing she had never forgotten. She had saved someone. A man, trapped in a burning car. A man who had looked at her like she was his last hope. And then, she had run. Because she had to. Because if she had stayed, they would have found her. And they would have made sure she never had the chance to save anyone ever again. Shaq gripped the steering wheel, his mind still reeling. Ellie had saved him that night. And now, someone was trying to kill her. Who was she really? And more importantly, who was hunting her? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. A message. From an unknown number. Shaq's jaw clenched as he read the words. "She's running out of time." A cold dread settled over him. Whoever was after Ellie wasn't finished. And if Shaq didn't find her first, she wouldn't survive this time. The words on the screen felt like a noose tightening around her throat. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't a warning. It was a promise. For years she had been careful, changing cities, changing names, never staying in one place too long. But something had gone wrong. She had let her guard down, and now they had found her. Ellie's breathing was sharp, shallow. She forced herself to move, pushing off the bed and pacing the small motel room. Her mind raced. Who had sent the message? It wasn't just a threat. It was a message from the past. Her past. The one she had buried under fake IDs and whispered warnings. The one that should have never resurfaced. She stared at the phone screen again, willing herself to think. The number was blocked. Of course, it was. A ghost reaching out. A ghost with unfinished business. A ghost who wanted her gone. Ellie's stomach twisted. The fire. It wasn't an accident. They hadn't just been trying to scare her. They had been trying to erase her. For good. Shaq pulled his truck into an empty gas station lot and killed the engine, His mind was a storm. Ellie Carter wasn't real. The files he had pulled, the records he had dug into, it all pointed to the same thing. She was living under a false identity. The name, the social security number, even the lease on the apartment that had just gone up in flames, none of it was real. And if that wasn't bad enough, whoever had come after her wasn't finished. Shaq had seen plenty of arson cases in his career, but this one? It wasn't about money. It wasn't about covering tracks. This was personal. They had wanted her dead. Ellie sat cross-legged on the motel bed, hands buried in her hair. The panic was setting in. She had been running for so long. Running from a name she wasn't allowed to say. Running from a man who was supposed to be untouchable. Vincent Holloway. She barely whispered it in her mind, even thinking it felt dangerous. She had thought she was safe. She was wrong. The fire was a message. A message that said, "We know where you are, and this time, you won't escape." A hard knock on the motel door made Ellie jump. Her heart pounded as she grabbed the small knife she kept under her pillow, creeping toward the door. "Ellie, it's me." Shaq's voice. She exhaled shakily, her fingers still gripping the knife. "Open the door." Ellie hesitated, then slid the deadbolt free, cracking the door open. Shaq stood there, his presence too big for the tiny doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they had questions, lots of them. She swallowed. "How did you find me?" Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he held up his phone. The screen showed a message. "She's running out of time." Ellie's blood turned to ice. She pulled the door open wider, stepping back. Shaq entered without hesitation, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Shaq's voice cut through the silence. "You're not just some random victim." Ellie looked away. Shaq stepped closer, his voice low, firm. "Tell me the truth, Ellie." She hesitated. This was it. She could lie. She could run. Or she could tell him everything. She took a deep breath, and then she told him the truth. Ellie sat down on the bed, staring at her hands. "When I was 15, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." Shaq's expression didn't change, but she felt his focus sharpen. "My father, he was a prosecutor, a good one. He was building a case against Vincent Holloway." She exhaled shakily. "But he never got to finish it." Shaq didn't speak, waiting. Ellie forced herself to continue. "One night, I came home late. My parents were supposed to be asleep. But when I walked in," her voice cracked. Shaq didn't move, didn't push. Ellie swallowed hard, forcing herself to finish. The house was already burning. Ellie remembered the flames, the way they crawled across the ceiling, the smoke, the heat, and the bodies. She had barely made it out. And Holloway? He had made sure no one ever found evidence of what her father had uncovered. No trial, no witnesses, no survivors. Except for her. Shaq leaned back, processing everything. Ellie had spent years hiding from a man who didn't leave loose ends. And now, he was hunting her again. "That fire wasn't just a warning," Shaq said. "It was supposed to be the end of you." Ellie nodded slowly. Shaq ran a hand over his jaw, his mind racing. This was bigger than he thought. And now? He wasn't just protecting a witness. He was standing between Ellie and the man who had already tried to kill her once. Ellie's phone buzzed. A new message. Shaq's eyes flicked to the screen just as Ellie read the words out loud. "Time's up." A sharp knock rattled the motel door. Ellie's breath caught. Shaq moved fast, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. Another knock. Harder this time. Shaq's instincts screamed. They weren't alone. "We need to go. Now." Ellie didn't argue. She grabbed her bag as Shaq peered out the window. Two figures, dark suits, not cops, not here to talk. Shaq clenched his jaw. Too late. The fire had been the first move. Now, the hunt was on. The truth wasn't supposed to look like this. Shaq sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the file on his phone. His gut was already twisted with unease, but now it felt like the ground had cracked beneath him. Ellie's past wasn't just connected to danger. It was connected to him. And the person behind all of this? had been pulling strings in both their lives for years. It started with a name, buried deep in the records his contact had sent him, hidden in old reports and classified files. A name Shaq hadn't heard in years, one he had forced himself to forget. Vincent Holloway. The memory of the man was sharp, like a blade pressed against his skin. Holloway had been untouchable, a businessman to the public, but anyone who had worked in the shadows of this city knew the truth. He was a puppeteer, pulling strings from behind the scenes, making people disappear like they had never existed. And 5 years ago, Shaq had almost been one of them. A cold sweat formed at the back of his neck. The accident, the one that nearly killed him, the one that should have left him in the flames. It hadn't been an accident at all. And now, Vincent Holloway's name was tied to Ellie. Ellie paced the small motel room, arms wrapped around herself, trying to hold it together. Shaq had been quiet since he walked in. Too quiet. Finally, she couldn't take it. "What?" she demanded. "What did you find?" Shaq's jaw tightened. He tossed his phone onto the bed, the screen still glowing with the file he had pulled up. Vincent Holloway. The color drained from Ellie's face. She didn't even have to look. She already knew. She lowered herself onto the bed slowly, like her legs couldn't hold her up anymore. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone, scrolling through the documents. Pictures, reports. A name she had spent years running from. "He tried to kill you, didn't he?" Shaq's voice was steady, but she could hear the storm beneath it. Ellie exhaled shakily. "Not just me." Shaq's eyes darkened. "Who else?" Ellie swallowed hard. The words felt like glass in her throat. "My family." A long silence stretched between them. Shaq ran a hand over his face, trying to process it. "Why?" Ellie looked down. "Because my father found something he wasn't supposed to. Something that could destroy Holloway." Shaq stared at her, pieces clicking into place. "And you saw it too?" Ellie nodded slowly. "I was just a kid. I didn't understand what I was looking at. But Holloway, he couldn't take that risk. So he erased everything. Our house burned down with my parents inside. I survived because I wasn't home that night." Shaq's throat went dry. "You've been running ever since." Ellie didn't answer. She didn't have to. But Shaq wasn't done. "Why was he after me?" Ellie finally met his gaze, something haunted in her expression. "Because you weren't supposed to survive that crash." The words hit Shaq like a punch to the chest. His accident, the one he barely crawled out of, the one that nearly killed him, wasn't an accident. Vincent Holloway had tried to kill him too, and suddenly, everything made sense. Shaq felt the weight of it pressing down on him. Ellie wasn't just some woman running from a dangerous past. She was the last piece of a puzzle he didn't even know he had been trying to solve. And Holloway. He had been playing this game long before Shaq even realized he was on the board. Shaq exhaled, his mind racing. "Ellie, we have to move. Now." Ellie frowned. "Why? What did you—" Shaq's phone buzzed. A message. "Unknown number. You're too late." Shaq's stomach turned to ice. Ellie saw the shift in his face. "What?" Before he could answer, the motel's power cut out. The room plunged into darkness. Ellie's breath hitched. "Shaq, get down," he ordered, already moving. The air was thick with tension. Something wasn't right. Shaq crept toward the window, his instincts screaming. The streetlights outside flickered, barely illuminating the empty parking lot. But something about the emptiness felt wrong. It was too quiet. Then, a single car door clicked shut. Shaq's muscles tensed. They weren't alone. "Ellie, we're leaving. Now." She didn't argue. She was already reaching for her bag. But as soon as they stepped into the hallway, Shaq knew they had made a mistake. Footsteps. Coming from the stairwell. Ellie sucked in a breath. "We're trapped." Shaq's jaw clenched. Not yet. He grabbed Ellie's hand and pulled her toward the back exit. They had seconds. As they reached the door, Ellie hesitated. "Shaq, what if—" He looked at her, his grip tightening. "We don't stop running until I say so. Got it?" Ellie swallowed hard. "Got it." And then they were gone. Shaq drove fast, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Ellie sat beside him, her hands gripping her knees, her breath uneven. They had barely made it out. But this wasn't over. Shaq knew Holloway, knew the way men like him worked. This was a warning. The next time, there wouldn't be a chance to run. Ellie finally spoke. "Where are we going?" Shaq's jaw tightened. "Somewhere they won't expect." She frowned. "Where's that?" Shaq glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Home." Ellie blinked. "Home? What do you—" Shaq's phone buzzed again. Another message. Ellie looked down at the screen, and when she read the words, all the color drained from her face. "Your past is waiting for you." Ellie turned to Shaq, her voice barely above a whisper. "They know where we're going." Shaq exhaled, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. "Then we finish this, once and for all." The silence in the car was suffocating. Shaq's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the highway stretched endlessly ahead. The weight of what they were about to do pressed heavy against his chest, but he refused to let it show. Beside him, Ellie sat rigid, her hands curled into fists in her lap. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the motel. But she didn't need to. He could feel the fear rolling off her in waves. Vincent Holloway had controlled her life for years. He had taken her family, stolen her identity, and forced her to live in the shadows. And Shaq? He had nearly lost his life because of him. Now it was time to end it. Ellie's voice finally broke the silence. "This is a mistake." Shaq didn't take his eyes off the road. "We don't have another option." Ellie exhaled, shaking her head. "You don't know what he's capable of." Shaq glanced at her. "I know what he did to you, and I know what he did to me." His voice was steady, controlled. "He thinks he owns the past. We're here to remind him that he doesn't." Ellie turned her face toward the window, watching the trees blur past. She didn't argue again, because she knew. There was no turning back. Shaq pulled up to the location Holloway had sent, a private estate just outside the city, surrounded by towering iron gates and thick forest. The gates opened before they even touched them, like Holloway had been expecting them. As Shaq and Ellie stepped out of the car, the weight of the moment settled between them. The estate was a kingdom built on corruption. Marble floors, a grand chandelier dripping in gold, thick carpets designed to mute the footsteps of men who thrived in the shadows. At the far end of the room, Vincent Holloway stood waiting. He was everything Shaq expected. Tall, silver-haired, a calculated presence in a tailored suit. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice because he never had to. A glass of whiskey swirled in his hand, his expression calm. "You made good time," Holloway mused, taking a slow sip. "I wondered how long it would take you to accept my invitation." Ellie stiffened beside Shaq. Her breathing was controlled, but her hands trembled. Holloway's gaze slid to her, and his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Ellie," he said smoothly. "Or should I say, the girl who refuses to disappear." Shaq took a step forward, voice steady. "It's over, Holloway." Holloway sighed. "Over? No, 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 you don't understand how this works." He tilted his head, amused. "You don't win against me. You survive as long as I allow it." Ellie's fists clenched. "You destroyed my family." Holloway swirled the liquid in his glass. Unbothered. "Your father got involved in things that weren't his concern. I simply corrected that mistake." Shaq took another step forward, his presence towering, immovable. "You tried to kill me too." His voice was calm, controlled, deadly. The crash. The fire. Holloway raised a brow. "You were collateral damage, nothing personal." Ellie exhaled sharply, her anger flickering into something sharp and dangerous. "And what about the fire last week?" she asked. "Was that nothing personal too?" A slow smirk. "That," Holloway said, tilting his glass. "That was a reminder. Loose ends should stay buried, Eleanor." Her breath hitched. Shaq watched her carefully. He could see it, the fear she had spent years hiding creeping back in. But then, something shifted. Ellie straightened, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "You should be scared, Vincent." Holloway chuckled. "Of what?" Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a flash drive. Holloway's smirk disappeared. Shaq held up the drive, his expression unreadable. Your records, every dirty deal, every payout, every name tied to you. He tossed it onto the table between them. This doesn't belong to you anymore. For the first time, Holloway hesitated. Shaq saw it. That flicker of doubt. The realization that he wasn't the one in control anymore. You think this changes anything? Holloway scoffed, but his voice had lost its casual ease. Ellie stepped forward, standing beside Shaq. It changes everything. Holloway's gaze flickered between them, searching for leverage, for control, but he had none left. Shaq saw it happen, the exact moment Holloway realized he wasn't untouchable anymore. Shaq leaned in slightly. You can't run from this, Holloway. The power you built, it's crumbling and you know it. Ellie's voice was soft but firm. You always thought you could erase me, that no one would remember I existed. She took a breath. But I remember. And then, she smiled, not out of amusement, not out of fear, but because for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of him anymore. Holloway exhaled slowly, stepping back. You have no idea what you've started, he murmured. Shaq smirked. Guess we'll find out. And then he turned, walking away. Ellie hesitated for only a moment before following. For years, Holloway had been the monster in her nightmares, the shadow she had been running from. Now, she was the one leaving him behind. The sun was rising when they finally stopped driving. A quiet stretch of highway. No threats, no running. Just the sound of the world waking up. Ellie sat on the hood of the car, staring at the horizon. Shaq leaned against the door, watching her. You did it, he said. She smiled slightly. We did it. Silence stretched between them. Ellie exhaled, shaking her head. You know what's funny? Shaq raised a brow. I used to have this dream, she said. About fire, about saving someone. And every time I woke up I thought, why does it feel so real? Shaq's chest tightened. She looked at him then, blue eyes meeting his, the flicker of recognition finally settling in. And then, Ellie remembered, the wreck, the burning car, Shaq. Her breath hitched. You, she whispered. Shaq nodded, his voice soft. Yeah. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, not from fear, but from relief. For so long she had wondered if her past meant anything, if the life she had saved all those years ago had ever mattered. Now she knew, because that same life had just saved her. Ellie exhaled shakily, wiping at her face. Well, she sniffed, smiling slightly. Guess we're even now. Shaq chuckled. I'd say so. A beat. Then, where to next? Ellie asked. Shaq smirked. Anywhere we want. And with that, they drove toward a future that, for the first time, belonged to them. Love a story packed with suspense, twists, and unforgettable characters? If you enjoyed this thrilling, high-stakes ride, there's more where that came from. Follow for more gripping stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe to get exclusive content, behind-the-scenes insights, and first access to our latest thrillers. Join the conversation. What would you have done in Ellie and Shaq's place? Drop a comment and let's talk suspense, justice, and second chances.